On the Hunt of Lost Mines. By Nogard ruler Brynn. Chapter 1. You sure you want me to tell you about that trip? She asked, giving me a fearsome side-eye and taking a swig of her rust-colored drink. I nodded. She ran her wrinkled, time-worn hand through her greasy thinning hair, which I was sure once a vibrant red, but now faded to dying embers and cooling ash. She turned to me, those eyes, they had the look I so often got on these ventures, one of utter confusion muddled with pity. After a few heavy moments of deep eye contact, I slid another 20 next to her freshly emptied glass. She shrugged and her wrinkles contorted into contempt as she turned back to the bar. Suit yourself. I first met Mr. James Corbrick on the day we were fittin' to set sail. It was rainin' fiercely and the whole crew was scramblin' about tryin' our damnedest to get all the equipment on and keep everything dry as possible. I was tryin' to keep a crate from totterin' off when the winch slipped and the hulking hunk of wood barreled down right for the captain and the gentleman he was escortin', a man dressed in a dark overcoat and a flat-brimmed fedora carrying a rather large leather trunk. The captain looked up and just barely halted his companion before the crate arrived at their feet with a violent thud. I was a fresh deckhand, you see, only done a few odd jobs on some crabbing excursions and never in this kind of weather. I shouted over the rampaging storm, "Look out," but it was all too late. The captain led the man on around my near-fatal mistake, only once casting a scolding glance up to my perch. My first interaction with Mr. Corbrick, I nearly used him to paint our new polished deck crimson. Sometime later when I was relieved and heading to my quarters I thought of apologizing to the poor man I nearly flattened. I asked around if any of my new mates had seen the fellow. It turned out he was on the lower deck gambling with some of the cook's boys and other deckhands. He had since shed off his overcoat and instead sported a lavish crimson vest, comfortable slacks, and a scuffed pair of dress shoes. His pale and gaunt body, that which reminded me of a corpse, was offset by hair that burned just as strong and red as mine. His behavior matched his hair's vibrancy tenfold. He was eccentric and teeming with energy and life. He was having the boys explain a game called Dice Hunt to him, a gambling game of sorts I never learned to grasp. I watched and waited for my time to jump in and say my piece as they roared and argued over the outcome of 3 cheaply carved pieces of stone. I wasn't good with talking, not an antisocial mind you, I just always had to force the words out. Conversating never came natural to me lest I had a drink in my hand, least that's what my wife always says. Finally, after watching these dogs swindle each other for an hour, the fine gentleman finally concedes. He left with nothing but his hands in his pockets. I followed after and only just reached the stairs to one of the lower decks when I finally called out, "Pardon, sir," and he stopped. I then laid out my apology. "Sir, I'd like to formally apologize for nearly crushing you with a crate." I adjusted myself awkwardly and bowed my head, scrunching my face as I realized how utterly poor that apology was. A few moments of silence and then, "Oh, that was you. No harm, no foul," he said almost cheerfully, "just don't make a habit of it, He chuckled, which turned into a coughing fit, and I raised my head gobsmacked. He wasn't angry. He saw my confusion and reassured me, "My dear, in my line of work, fatality is all but an inconvenient inevitability. So long as that wasn't an honest attempt I see no need to dwell on it." He waved his arm dismissively and turned to go down the stairs, gripping the rail tight as he did. I wouldn't see Mr. Corbrick again for another few days, not until the storm lifted enough for us to officially set sail. I had no idea where we were off to, nor exactly what we were doing, and a small part of me hoped the rest of the crew was just as in the dark as me. On the first day that the clouds stopped their weeping, I leaned against the railing as my shift was coming to an end. We were officially heading out, I took out a photo of the thing I held most dear. Focusing on the subject had me lost, and I didn't even notice a figure had joined me. It's about time. Damn clouds have been plaguing us something fierce, eh? Caught off guard by his voice, my head snapped to the side. Mr. Corbrick had taken a place next to me, resting himself on the railing, looking up to the gray blanketed sky. His battered overcoat had made its return, but his hat was absent, his hair slicked back and seemed completely unbothered by the harsh winds. "Your girl. The picture, I mean?" he asked, nodding in my direction, his eyes preoccupied gazing across the water, trying to grasp every detail that the horizon held. I simply nodded and folded the picture delicately and placed it back in my peacoat's breast pocket. I joined his fruitless search as I turned and mimicked his stance. "Just married," I said, my voice dampened by the scarf wrapped around the bottom half of my face. "My second pardon gift. This will be a lovely honeymoon. She'll absolutely love the beaches." He snickered at his own joke. I indulged and gave a half-hearted "heh," but my thoughts were just as far as that horizon. It took me a few deep breaths, and who knows how long before I finally turned and asked him, "So what exactly are we doing, sir?" "If you don't mind telling me." He broke his connection to the horizon and shot me a side-eye accompanied by a smirk. "Million-dollar question you ask, miss, but I don't mind telling you." Howard was always the cagey sort, keeping some piece of information locked away inside the brilliant mind. He cast his sight down to the water crashing against the ship's hull as he said that. He then turned to me, and this time he mirrored my pose, saying, "This is a research mission, so to speak. New ruins have just been discovered deep in the North Ossetian deserts. The sands have shifted just right, and so I and a team of locals are tasked to go and find some buried history. You all just have to get me and some of this equipment there in one piece." He smiled and then added, "And then you all get to enjoy lovely beaches, kind locals, and quite diverse amounts of delicious meals." That wasn't what I expected him to say. For all Mr. Cobrick's eccentric tastes and the air of mystery surrounding him and this job, we were simply going to look at some old rocks and houses that had been drowned in sand for the past few dozen centuries. I was both relieved and disappointed, though I knew that meant this job was an easy one and Jane would just laugh off her worry when I got back and told her I'd have some interesting souvenirs and enough money to take us both on our actual honeymoon. "Mr. Corbrick, Captain wants to see you before we set sail." The first mate had marched her way up to us. I went stiff. Mr. Corbrick turned and raised himself to meet her. "Thank you. And I told you to call me James." He brushed off the front of his coat. "Sorry, sir, formalities," was all the first mate replied with, her granite-like personality glaring down on the both of us. Her stature was no different. A truly imposing woman. Mr. Corbrick turned back to me, bowed politely, and said, "Best we start, that way we can get you right back to that wife of yours." He grinned and walked off with the first mate. I called out after they rounded a corner, "I don't know what you mean, sir. This is our honeymoon." Chapter 2. We finally set off. The crew was in terrific spirits. We got to know one another quite well, and I made many a friend on that voyage. The sea was fair and winds were kind the whole way from Vlukuen to Ossetian. We were kept busy, mind you, but not to the point we were overworked. Mr. Corbrick became quite the celebrity, sharing what he knew of this mission and even recounting some of his previous excursions. The crew was less on edge now that we were being told the full picture. About halfway we ran into a bit of trouble when one of my fellow deckhands drunkenly broke into Mr. Corbrick's quarters, and a scuffle ensued. Neither were seriously injured, but the captain was none too happy. Not long after I was on night duty with that same deckhand, we were a bit tipsy and shootin' the piss when he told me something I now know was one of them red flags. That night he said to me, "Hey, Burner, you know how I stumbled into that Corbrick fellow's room the other night?" "Yeah." I gave a half nod. Gossip seemed to spread faster than fleas on any ship. "Well, I was only half drunk, and what I saw turned me right sober," he said, leaning closer, eyes bugging out. I side-eyed him. "What you mean?" I pressed. "Well, here I thought I was down a deck or two and was seeing if Tommy had any more Fleck gin. When I opened that bulkhead and stumbled in, I saw Corbrick leaning over a big old trunk, but that wasn't what got me. He had his shirt off and there were strange markings all over him." I shrugged his story off. "So he's got some tattoos." "Half the crew got tattoos." "Hell, don't you have one from your Navy days?" The liquor had loosened my tongue. "These weren't no tattoos," he hissed. "They looked more like scars, like someone carved them in his flesh, littering his body. And besides that, he had a big-ass syringe next to his leg, covered in blood and something else." I was skeptical and crossed my arms over my chest. From what I could piece together from that half-drunk story was Mr. Corbrick had some traumatic past that left him scared, and he might need medicine for some unseen disease, or he simply slaved himself to some drug in order to quell those traumas. I kept quiet. No need to argue with that bloke. I spent the rest of the shift silent, sobering up. When we finally made landfall, we did so at the largest fishing town bordering the northern edge of the wasteland that was Assisian. I suppose Captain and Mr. Corbrick decided there so Mr. Corbrick didn't have to traverse as much desert if we were to land at the trading dock of Moss Hall. We spent most of the twilight offloading everything necessary. The locals were awestruck at our cargo vessel. They helped out where they could and were quite the hospitable sort, a skin all about our travel and complimenting our ship. To be frank with you, I still think they were buttering us up so we'd be more inclined to purchase some of their trinkets and fresh fish. Most of the crew spent whatever they had, others held tight to their coin purses and simply wanted a good meal. I personally made a promise and planned to keep it. The small bazaar, I think that's what they called it, had little tables and booths spanning most of the main street and along where the dock faded to buildings. I went looking with a few mates. One found herself a fine pair of earrings. Another found himself an old crescent blade that glinted a bluish gold in the dwindling sunset. While perusing, I came across a small stand smashed between two extravagantly gargantuan booths. The little lady resting behind the near ground level table looked up at us with eyes set deep in her skull. The way the shadows fell, one might have been convinced they were nothing more than sockets containing no eyes at all. She looked ancient. But look who's talking. I glanced at her wares. Nothing too peculiar except an odd-looking statue and a beautiful ring. The ring looked to be made of the same metal as the crescent sword my mate had with him. There was also an elegant gemstone embedded in the center. The gemstone was an odd deep-sea color and ornately carved into a rectangle. The only flaw was that it had a very distinct crack spanning two opposite corners and little fractures that branched out in all directions. When I picked it up, I saw an inscription written along the inner lining. I couldn't make it out. I wasn't familiar with the Assisian language. When I tried getting a closer look, the antique saleswoman asked, like. I broke from my investigating and looked down to meet her inquisitive and leathery face. I nodded awkwardly, caught off guard. "Free. Is broken anyway." "No one else wants," she said, shaking her head and waving her hand. I bowed best I could and showered her with appreciation. She smiled and patted my head, saying, "Malu, Filish mare. Have a safe journey." I thanked her once more before we all set off back to the ship. At the dock I saw Mr. Corbrick speaking with two roguish types, and when our little posse approached they seemed to become quite skittish. All except, of course, Mr. Corbrick. He waved with a large careless smile. He was once more stripped down to just his lavish vest and bright long-sleeve undershirt. He concluded his business and followed us up the gangway. Not too long after, a majority of the crew were back on board. The captain called a meeting in the galley. Captain, with a grim look, said some of us were going with Mr. Corbrick, and then went on to tell us that those staying not to fuck around or get in any trouble while we were docked. Decent amount of the crew wasn't surprised, and for the most part seemed to be expectant that, though a few booed and griped. Mr. Corbrick then stepped forward to explain and to calm the upset. I know some of you were under the assumption I was going without you on this expedition, but plans changed. The guides who Dr. Davis arranged to lead my group just informed me they were undermanned and couldn't afford to take the equipment and complete all our objectives in the time frame provided without additional manpower. I apologize, this wasn't in the cards for me either. I know this isn't what you all signed up for, and believe me, I couldn't live with myself if any of you were to get hurt. But things as they stand now seem to be that I will need a group of at least 10. Rest assured, I'll see to it that you are well compensated for your extra work. If you're interested in volunteering, I'll be in my quarters. The crew murmured amongst themselves and nodded, all slowly seeing things Mr. Corbrick's way. After some deliberation, the consensus was that those that wanted to volunteer would do so, but we'd all draw straws if the group came up short. I wasn't the first to find Mr. Corbrick, and so I felt less on edge when entering his quarters. Passing one of the cook's boys on his way out, Mr. Corbrick's voice cheerily called out, "Next." He was staying in a cabin akin to something the captain or first mate had. His room was well organized. There were some dusty volumes on the little shelf mounted to the one wall, on his desk a neat stack of papers, a few pencils and pens and closed books. His bed almost appeared untouched, and underneath I could clearly see the rather large trunk he was carrying the day he boarded. Mr. Corbrick himself sat in the standard chair provided to the cabin. Fastened the door. He was holding a clipboard and pen. He looked up at me and smiled. "So looking to dig up some history? Or are you just looking to treat that wife of yours to a fancy dinner when you get back?" "I'd say it's both, sir, but then I'd be lying to ya." I joked at him. "Well, I don't think your wife would be pleased to hear that." He shot back with a chuckle, marking something down on his clipboard. He then readjusted his posture, asked for my full name and address, which I gave, then said he'd see me tomorrow. Our journey was long and sweltering. The sun in the Assisian desert was utterly brutal and baked most of us northerners. The nights were wonderfully cool, and laying on the shifting sand staring up at the beautiful constellations was an experience that almost made that trip worth it, almost. Took a week to make it to these new ruins, though another red flag appeared, so to say. When the rest of us were dying of heat and sweating, attempting to rid ourselves of every fabric that clung to us, Mr. Corbrick remained the same as when we left, just as clothed, not sweating a drop. At the time I, along with the others, were preoccupied with our own sun-scorched selves, and so even though we noticed, we paid it no mind. And it wouldn't have mattered, the sight of the ruins had us in its grips not long after. From the fallen sand dunes rose ancient spires and homes. They were all made from finely carved stone, definitely not sandstone, mind you, something smoother, more ancient. The most intriguing aspect was that the whole of those ruins looked like they were tilted, Sladen-like. The guides had no interest in joining us and said to watch our unattended equipment and campsite. They looked real perturbed by the ruins. We unloaded what equipment Mr. Corbrick instructed us to and made our way down to the first half-submerged structure. Now I won't bore you with every nook and cranny that we explored. All I'll say is Mr. Corbrick had us be extremely thorough. What I will tell you is about our last day at the ruins. Mr. Corbrick gathered us around and said, "I promised you all compensation, and I am a man of my word. However, even with the success of this expedition, our generous benefactor is less than likely to be sending additional payment. Now the things here have been buried for at least 1,000 to 2,000 years, so you can imagine their value to the right people. I never condone stealing, and in fact if I saw anyone take anything more than photographs for personal gain from these ruins, I would report you to the proper authorities. That being said, you all have 4 hours without my supervision. Spend them how you see fit. With that, we all made off in our own directions, trying to recall the most valuable expensive pieces we found while exploring. I made my way to a very small hut right behind one of the more submerged spires. I found it some days ago, but got called to help before I could look inside. It seemed to be a cant little shack, nothing too out of the ordinary from the rest. I crossed the threshold and a deep disturbing feeling crept into my bones. I can't really describe it. It was the feeling you get when you're visiting a widow, just a mournful air filling the house. The inside matched all the other small ones like it pound for pound, and yet I felt almost drawn to it. That feeling was growing stronger and soon had me slipping into the back bedroom where I wished I had never gone. There, curled up on what I'm sure was once a bed, was the twisted corpse of some poor soul weeping. I say corpse and not skeleton because leathery skin was still wrapped taut around each and every bone, the muscles beneath were flexed and dried like jerky, the lips pulled back over the cracked yellow teeth and horrid receding gums. I was almost thankful the one large hand was covering the top portion of its face, concealing the rest of the mortifying expression. Its other hand draped loosely across its resting place, as if it was waiting to comfort and embrace another that never came. As I stood for an eternity, frozen stiff with fear, studying every detail of this relic, I noticed the ring finger on the extended arm was missing. Disgustingly, there were some crumbs, for lack of a better word, of petrified skin and muscle laying muddled with the sand and grime. It wasn't that it had simply fallen off either, there was no sign of it. I know 'cause I proceeded to search for it. Anything to keep my eyes away from that scene. The air only got heavier, every second I could feel the morning emotion seep in deeper into me. Then I swear I even began to hear a crestfallen voice. It was calling out faintly, "Come back." I backed out of the room, too afraid to look at the corpse, but also too scared to turn my back to it. Once I was finally free of that place, I felt a chill caress my neck. The night air was crisp. I was then blinded by the fresh incandescent light of an electric torch. "Burner! Where the hell have you been, lass? We've been looking for you for hours." It was one of my crew mates shouting. Before I could orient myself, he was at my side. I stumbled and couldn't raise the strength to say anything. When we returned to the camp, everyone was concerned. The guides saw to my condition. I was trembling so bad you'd have thought I was a paint mixer. All the drinks they tried to give me should have been used to water the sands, but I couldn't get one drop to my mouth. I said nothing and rested my head only to find a torrent of nightmares. Getting back seemed only to last to the next night, though I'm sure it took us just as long, if not longer. I could hardly tell, my nights were mostly sleepless. And yet the effect of what I saw, while slowly fading, never left. Truth is, even now I still feel that deep mourning and loneliness. It hangs like a distant fog. It haunts me. Though I can say it's nothing like that house. Chapter 3. The ship and crew were waiting for us. From their reception of our return, it looked like the village's hospitality was wearing thin. Everyone worked double time and we were able to leave at daybreak. After we set sail, there was never a day that wasn't dark and violent, or at least grey and cold. We were all kept busy and I saw very little of Mr. Corbrick, only passes in the hall and glimpses on the main deck. Then, not too far into our voyage, my nightmares returned. Only these ones were far more vivid and even now are still burned deep into my memory. One night I was walking through ice-white halls. Thin skeletal beings twice my height were aimlessly wandering and howling in pain. They gripped their heads tightly, some covering their eyes, the others their ears. They filled me with a frightening remembrance of that awful corpse. I finally arrived at a round central room. Ornate pillars carved with intricate yet disturbing patterns, they resembled twisted bodies intertwined. I could not see the roof they held, for they seemed to stretch far beyond what my mind could conjure. The whole room was tilted. I had to take an awkward stance to keep upright. Sitting at the center of the room was a raised platform that held a pedestal. It was surrounded by dozens of those Moro-use skeletal beings. They knelt before it in some form of prayer. As I got closer I could hear them, tens, no, hundreds of voices all muttering and shrieking in an unharmonious cacophony. Separate incomplete thoughts, scared indiscernible ramblings, and simple inner nihilistic monologues, all were melded together in a horrifying soliloquy. I began to approach the raised pedestal. Each step was worse than the last, yet I pressed forward, afraid that if I turned back the storm of voices would sweep me into deafening silence. And despite the appalling pain the voices were inflicting, I felt deep down silence would be far worse. I finally reached the platform and its stairs, the horrendous orchestra of voices now so mixed and blended they were no more than hurricane winds, ripping apart my mind, but I couldn't turn back. Even the thought of isolation and silence would be too much to bear. Before I could even step on the platform a hand grasped my leg. The chill of its grip was so cold it burned. I turned back to find one of the figures holding me. Its face buried in the floor, its unoccupied hand clawing at its skull. I pulled and the grip tightened. I looked back to the pedestal. It was gone, replaced by one of the beings. It stood, its fingers resting elegantly upon its temples. It looked the same as all the others, except it seemed at peace. Resting upon its head was what looked like a delicately carved tiara, crimson gemstones ingrained at various symmetric points. The grip loosened, and when I turned to my shackles owner, they, along with all the others, vanished. At the same time the overwhelming torrent of Disticlus voices had faded. The last wisp was a word so soft I almost missed it, no, and then I awoke. I found I wasn't alone in these nightmares. The whole crew seemed deprived of good rest. When I'd question them they'd give tales similar to mine, but never of the round room, nor of the crowned figure. They only told of the endless confusing hallways and tall anorexic beings, yowling in pain and clutching their skulls in various ways. After weeks a few of the crew couldn't take it and threw themselves to the sea. One bloke who snuck on a gun saw to it he'd never have another dream again. Took days to clean that up. Morale was all but a concept none would dare believe anymore. But the most disturbing of it all, the ones who couldn't take it, the ones who gave up, well, when wandering those ice-white halls, I swear the number of those skeletal things grew, and between the howls of pain I could hear sobs that sounded all too familiar. The last night before we were home I made a discovery that set me to never take on another expedition again. You take what may mean you will from this. The nightmare played out same as every night before, except after weeks the shock of it all began to wane, and I began noticing details. The detail that still makes me regret ever going was on the hand of the thing that held me back each night. When I looked upon the form that gripped me, I finally saw that on the hand that dug deep into its scalp was a seemingly identical duplicate of the ring I had gotten from that old saleswoman. The metal, the design, all except the fracture of the gem. This gem's fissure was far worse than the one I had in my possession. Where mine had a simple split from corner to corner and small branching paths, the ring belonging to the being at my feet was closer to the pattern of a snowflake. It had a deep indent at the center and a myriad of hairline fractures accompanied by dozens of cavorn's cracks, all extending outward. It looked like someone had hit it with a bloody chisel. The color for the most part was still that deep sea blue, but right at the center was a storm cloud of deep red. And then when I turned back to the pedestal, the nightmare deviated. Now I was up on the pedestal. All the fine and intricate architecture was eroded and weathered. There was sand all around, and the color of everything held a sickly yellow. I was looking down at the tiara. My hands were resting on it, holding it, except these weren't my hands. These hands were pale. These hands were very thin, corpse-like. When they began lifting the crown up, not to wear but rather to inspect, the long sleeves wrapped around them fell, only slightly, but enough to show scars that looked to be in the shape of odd symbols. Finally the body. I was now a passive observer, turned and lowered the tiara into an open trunk. As it did, I heard a voice that now only sicknesses me to remember, saying, "Finally, Howard should be pleased." I woke up in a sweat, and ran to where I kept the ring. I held it to the oil lamp and studied each small crevice. That's when I heard that weak voice once more whisper, "No." That was the last thing it would ever say before resting at the bottom of the ocean. I saw to that personally. I never saw Mr. Corbrick in this time. No hide nor hair. The joyful corpse of a man had turned full recluse. No one saw him, not until we finally made landfall. Our ship docked and we all but threw ourselves off. The captain gave us a few days' leave to collect ourselves and drown those memories in all the liquor we could afford. When on our way to the bar, I caught my final glimpse of Mr. Corbrick. He was walking off, dressed full in his worn black overcoat and flap-brimmed fedora, and he had that large trunk with him now chained to his wrist. He loaded himself into an auto and off he went. The nightmare stopped the following night. Well, I hope that satisfied your curiosity. If I ever see that man again, well, it doesn't much matter. Jane died a few years back, and I'm hoping to join her sometime soon. She looked to me once more, a scowl contorting her face. We done? I nodded, satisfied, leaving another 20 on the bar and walking out into the rain.
Stories left unread. Please consider subscribing.